So Andrew Yang did an interview with Neil Cavuto, and I'm actually a little surprised here. Watch the whole interview. Neil Cavuto surprisingly asked some pretty incisive questions, which is super rare for a Fox News host or a Fox Business host. And Yang had some interesting answers that I want to break down here. There's a million parts of this interview that I could have pulled and talked about, but I'm pulling the parts that I found most interesting myself. So let's take a look and then I'll respond.
But is it the structure of the primary system that does it, or is it just the way it's evolved?
The primary system does advantage certain candidates. And in the Democratic Party, you can tell that there is a bit of a thumb on the scale being applied from folks in D.C. very often. The Republican Party is actually a little bit more open, where whoever wins the most votes ends up in Washington. But you saw it with the way that the DNC sandbagged Bernie in both of the last cycles. They weren't like, oh, let the voters decide. It was more like, let's try and have the right candidate win.
But Bernie might be getting the advantage, right? I mean, the rap you hear against Joe Biden is he campaigned as a moderate, but progressives are calling the shots, and Bernie Sanders is leading the parade. Do you agree with that? Well,
again, in my view, the Democratic Party should probably be two separate parties at this point. And you can see the tensions within them. And you can say, well, trying to get them in the same tent might facilitate them working together. In my view, the real problem is that there are a number of moderate Republicans who would support aspects of, for example, the infrastructure package, but because of political pressures, there is such a fissure that if they cross over, then they wind up getting criticized by Trump, even though historically the Republican Party has been for rebuilding bridges and roads.
Yeah, in fact, I remember distinctly President Trump wanted
to rebuild bridges and roads.
Right, $2 to $3 trillion. He wanted to go big, and now he's criticizing this plan that was a third of that. But be that as it may, he might run again. Looks like he is, and he might win.
Yeah, to that last point, yeah, I'd say he's actually the favorite right now. Trump would be the favorite to be the next president of the United States of America. So there's a few things there that I want to talk about. To that last point about infrastructure and Republicans support it, and then Trump turned on them, it's one of the most brazen flip-flops I think I've ever seen, is that Trump, when he was in office, he wanted to do an infrastructure bill. He talked about an infrastructure bill. They tried working out details of an infrastructure bill. And the price tag of the bill was very similar to the Biden traditional infrastructure bill. And you had, 13 Republicans who ended up crossing the aisle to get this traditional infrastructure bill passed. And it did pass. And now you have Trump and the other Republicans, they flip on a dime. And now they want to kick those Republicans who supported the infrastructure bill out of the party. They want to strip them of their committee assignments, kick them out of the party. I mean, it is astounding flip-flopping and astounding hypocrisy. So in other words, you support a policy that you view as good if and only if your party does it. That is rank partisan tribalism, and it's absolutely grotesque. And I think anybody can see through it if they're paying attention and if they're honest. So that is a correct point. It's totally accurate. And yeah, you know what? Now, unfortunately, because in many respects the Republican Party is a cult of personality, if they're going to be hesitant to cross the aisle for anything else for any reason after getting this much pushback for just voting for an infrastructure bill. So Yang also says in there the Democrats should be two parties. Look, I'd say I prefer we had a multi-party system. I would. You would need to do structural reforms to get us to a multi-party system. And so unless you talk about those structural reforms first, I think the conversation is useless. So now, to be fair to Yang, he is. In his forward party, he wants to do ranked choice voting and open primaries, which are two of the solutions. And so he is not putting the cart before the horse, as many do when they have this conversation. But that's, my contribution to this conversation is, if we're talking about a multi-party system, just understand there are structural barriers, and it is phenomenally difficult to actually change the nature of the political system to that extent. That is really like a top-down remake. And even though ideally it's something I would support more, I just know that the mountain you have to climb is Everest, or harder than Everest, to be fair. And also, if you're going to have the Democrats break up into two parties, well, then the Republicans should break up into two parties as well. Really, we'd be a much better country with 6, 7, 8 parties. But, listen, the fact of the matter is, even in a system like that, you would need to build coalitions with people who you don't really agree with on a lot of very key things. You know what I mean? So you could be like, a social democrat or a libertarian socialist, but in a coalition where you actually win on your legislative policy, you would have to convince so-called moderate Democrats. So the real problem, and this is what I think he misses, what Andrew Yang misses, the real problem is not just, it's just the two-party system and it's partisanship. No, it really is the corruption. The corruption is the heart of the problem. Because the reason why we never seem to get the policy that the people want in this country is because the politicians aren't representing the people. They're representing their corporate donors and their billionaire donors. That's the heart of the problem. And you need to talk about that as if that's the heart of the problem. Kabuto makes a hilarious point there where he says progressives are calling the shots. No, they're not. This Build Back Better bill is, first of all, it's probably not going to pass at all. But even if it does pass, it's so watered down that you can't even recognize it compared to the original proposal. I mean, it's a compromise to the compromise of the compromise of the compromise. So what do you mean progressives are calling the shots? Progressives are more frustrated than anybody in the entire system. We never get the things that we want. And if we did, by the way, the Democrats would keep winning because those things are really popular. But I'm burying the lead here. So he talks about how Trump's a fraud because he flipped on the infrastructure thing, but the part about sandbagging Bernie is true. And very few people say it in corporate media. The DNC did put their thumb on the scale. The DNC did sandbag Bernie. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take anybody's word for it. You go back and look. Those 2016 WikiLeaks that came out, which showed in no uncertain terms how the sausage is made and what's going on behind the scenes, you do get the sense they were working backwards from their conclusion. How do we get our person in? Our person's Hillary Clinton. And they would do anything and everything, fair and unfair, in order to, push her on the American people. And the results of that were Trump ended up becoming president. So that's true. And it is also true. A lot of people might not know this or might not admit it, but the GOP primary system is more open. It is, because they don't have superdelegates on the GOP side. The Democrats do. And even with the reforms, the superdelegates still have power. So that's all accurate. Listen, at the bottom line here is the things that I agree with Yang on completely: ranked choice voting, open primaries, UBI. And those are all positive things to keep pushing out there. Outside of that, I'm not sure I totally agree with the direction he's going with this forward party thing. He seems to be leaning more into enlightened centrism, if you will. And while partisanship is a problem, he sort of makes it out to be the main boogeyman. And again, another response I had to that is the people, forget the elites in Washington, D.C., the people are actually a lot more together than anybody realizes. Because when you put aside the culture war bullshit and you just focus on the actual economic issues and foreign policy issues, you have almost unanimous agreement in the country. You're to upwards of 60%, 70%, 80% on certain issues of people who want to end the wars, who want to legalize marijuana, who want to raise wages. I mean, for Christ's sake, in Florida in 2020, Trump won the state, but 60% voted for a higher minimum wage. That says it all right there. So it's really not that partisanship is the main problem. The main problem really is the corruption. So, and I don't agree with he sort of talks out of both sides of his mouth, Yang does, not in this clip, but when he talks about his forward party, half the time he's like, we need another option and we need to make this a real thing and a real contender. And then the other half of the time he says, look, I know that that's impossible and that's not going to happen. So what I really want to do is the DSA model where you could still be a Democrat or a Republican and the forward party will endorse you if you support our policies. It's like, you sort of have to pick one of those two. You can't say I'm going to do the DSA model, but also the revolutionary model of a third party that actually ends up winning everywhere. Because I got news for you. It's not like other people haven't tried that. And how many Green Party members are in the House? How many Libertarian Party members are in the House? How many Green Party members are in the Senate? How many Libertarian Party members are in the Senate? How many Green Party presidents have we had? How many Libertarian Party presidents have we had? It's just, in some ways, it strikes me as a fool's errand, which is why he falls back on, we're just doing the DSA model, where we'll endorse you if you're a Democrat or Republican. It's just hard because it's so structural in this country with Democrats and Republicans. But anyway, he's right that they sandbag Bernie, and he's right that Trump is a fraud. And I hope on his three main policy ideas, we do eventually succeed: ranked choice voting, open primaries, UBI.